Beer Riots. You heard right. 1919 UK, imagine the headlines.
Seriously, talk about a recipe for chaos, right?
We're going deep on this, digging into Washy Beer and Empty Cellars by Simon Fowler. He makes this point that these riots, they're almost ignored by a lot of historians.
Yeah, and that's wild when you think of the impact. It really gets at the heart of post-war Britain, trying to rebuild.
Right, everything's supposed to go back to normal, and that includes your pint. But things weren't so simple, were they? So set the scene for us. What was the beer situation like right after the war?
Well, wartime restrictions, they didn't disappear overnight. Production slashed, the beer itself seriously watered down.
Watered down, how?
They called it government ale, and let's just say it wasn't winning any awards. And on top of that, prices through the roof, obviously.
So not only are people dealing with, the aftermath of a world war, but their beer is what, warm, weak, and expensive? I'd be kind of irritated too.
You're getting it. This wasn't just about taste either. This was their lifeblood. Pubs, community, comfort, all completely disrupted.
Right, beer is serious business. And Fowler mentions you'd need 6 pints of this government ale just to feel anything?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to enjoy a night out when you need that much just to get a buzz.
Makes you wonder who was happy with this whole situation.
Well, not the pub goers, that's for sure. But the brewers. They were actually doing all right, profiting from these wartime measures even.
Get out of here.
There are even records of them worrying about being seen as, profiteers. And then you had the Publicans stuck in the middle.
Yeah, caught between their customers, desperate for a decent pint, and this weak beer they're being forced to sell. Tough spot.
Tough spot's an understatement. Fowler actually found a letter from a brewery owner to the Brewers Society, all worried about what would happen if they kept raising prices, especially for bottled beer, which wasn't regulated like draft.
So they knew they were sitting on, a powder keg of beer discontent, just waiting for it to blow.
Exactly. And you got to remember, this is a nation on edge.
Yeah.
Still reeling from the war. Soldiers coming home, factory workers, everyone feeling the pressure. All they wanted was some normalcy, a bit of comfort.
And they got government ale.
Bingo. And that's where the real resentment starts to brew. This wasn't just bad beer. This was a symbol. Like they were being ignored, even exploited after all they'd sacrificed.
A pint of disappointment. So how does this all go from grumbling over a pint to, full-on riots?
It's a perfect storm, really. You've got the dock workers, always a force to be reckoned with, protesting beer exports while they're stuck with shortages.
Adding insult to injury.
Then you've got the soldiers coming back from overseas, used to stronger, better quality beer, and they get home to this.
Another letdown on top of everything else.
Precisely. And it's the shared sense of being ignored, not being heard, that really fuels the fire.
So it becomes less about the beer itself and more what it represents.
Exactly. All these anxieties, frustrations bubbling under the surface of post-war society. The beer becomes the lightning rod.
And this is where Openshaw comes in, right? This is where it all ignites.
Openshaw, yeah, just outside Manchester, became quite the focal point for all this beer anger. Fowler talks about these protests, people outside these closed pubs with signs demanding more beer, better beer.
It's kind of funny to imagine, right? Protesting for a pint. But I bet the mood wasn't exactly a laugh a minute back then.
No, definitely not. But what's interesting is that these weren't organized protests or anything. This wasn't some union thing. It was just people pushed too far.
Everyday folks. Wow. Makes you think what the government was thinking as this was all going down, right? I mean, you'd think they'd have bigger fish to fry after a world war than worrying about the strength of beer.
Right. You'd think. But Fowler, he points out, they were actually really worried about the possibility of unrest, especially in those post-war years. They'd seen revolutions in other parts of Europe, sparked by less.
It's the let them drink weak beer problem, isn't it? It doesn't usually end well.
Not usually, no. This is the rise of communism, social and political upheaval everywhere. The last thing they wanted was a full-blown revolt at home. And this beer thing, well, it was a bit of a powder keg, wasn't it?
They were walking a tightrope, for sure.
Absolutely. On the one hand, these riots, an unhappy public wanting better beer and more of it. But on the other, you've got the temperance movement.
Ah, yes. The temperance movement. Always makes things interesting, doesn't it?
To say the least. And their timing couldn't have been worse for a government trying to handle this whole beer crisis. Imagine, right, you're trying to appease these thirsty, angry citizens, but you've also got to deal with a movement advocating for stricter alcohol control.
Talk about a rock and a hard place.
Right. Did they give the people what they wanted, Or did they stick to their guns, risk more unrest, try to appease the temperance folks? Tough spot.
So did Fowler find anything about how the government was dealing with these two sides?
He did. He found some amazing quotes, actually, from officials at the time. They were completely torn, trying to figure out how to make the public happy, let them have their beer, get back to some kind of normal,
Yeah.
but also promoting temperance, which was this moral thing for some. And of course, they knew that if they mishandled it, there'd be political fallout.
It was a powder keg, and they were trying to figure out how to diffuse it without, blowing everything up. So what did they do? Did they cave to the pressure for more and better beer? Or did they stick to their guns, so to speak, and risk further unrest? So they're dealing with thirsty citizens, a powerful temperance movement. What did they do?
In the end, they knew they couldn't exactly ignore the public.
Right.
They were trying to project this image of strength and stability after the war. Beer riots don't really fit that narrative.
Not really, no.
So they started making some concessions.
Gave the people what they wanted. Victory.
Kind of. Production slowly went back up to pre-war levels. That government ale, it thankfully faded into the history books. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets really interesting. Fowler found that even though all this happened, beer consumption across the UK, it actually went down in the years after.
Wait, hold on. They riot, they get better beer, and then they drink less of it. Something's not adding up here.
And that's why history is so interesting, isn't it? It's rarely a simple answer. Fowler thinks this shows those bigger societal changes we were talking about.
Yep.
Tastes were different. Plus, don't forget, this is the 20s. New and exciting things popping up everywhere. Radios, cars, all competing for people's time and their money.
The roaring 20s. It's all coming together now. We're not just talking about beer anymore, are we? We're talking about a whole society trying to figure itself out.
Exactly. These beer riots weren't just about a drink. They were about wanting things to go back to normal, about wanting to be heard. It was a society in flux, and that drop in beer drinking, it shows just how fast things were changing.
Love that. Started with the beer riot and uncovered a way bigger story about a really key moment in history.
History's never just about dates and names, is it? It's about real people, what they did, and all those things that happened because of the choices they made, even if no one expects them.
So true. Fowler mentions that the government spent something like 13 million pounds to, shall we say, smooth over this whole beer situation. That's an insane amount of money for back then. Shows how seriously they took it, even if it seemed, I don't know, kind of silly on the surface.
Makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Governments, they have to keep that balance, right? Satisfying what people want, but also doing things that maybe those same people need, even if they're not so happy about it at the time.
It's a challenge they're probably still dealing with, even today, when you think about it. Well, I'd say that just about wraps up our deep dive into the UK beer riots of 1919.
Cheers to that.
Cheers to that. A great reminder that sometimes the best stories are hidden in plain sight. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those questions, and hey, maybe even have a good pint just for fun.